One of the most famous paranormal games known today is known as Bloody Mary. You know the drill. Stand in front of a mirror in a dark room, say some random bird's name 3 times, and boom, demonic ghost apparition looks right back at you. Janet Langlois? Janet published her version of this summoning ritual in a 1978 paper revolving around folklore and legends. But what if I told you Bloody Mary is actually a real person, or she was, and the real figure is so much worse than the game she potentially inspired? Mary Tudor, or Mary I of England, was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She's one of the most likely suspects to have inspired the Bloody Mary game because she was known as the Bloody Queen of England. If you know anything about dear old Henry, he had a bit of a habit of either divorcing or decapitating his wives, unless they died before he had the chance to do either of those things. Catherine was just one of those 6 lucky ladies who managed to become Queen of England, albeit for a shorter period of time than many expected. The Pope, while seemingly having no qualms with Henry hacking off 2 of his wives' heads, had a major problem with divorce. Henry had the hots for Anne Boleyn and desperately wanted to get rid of his first wife, you see, and with no reason to separate her body from her head, he divorced her. It caused a massive hoo-ha with the rest of the Catholics, so Henry declared himself and the entirety of England as being in protest against the Catholic Church, becoming Protestants. Also, he could marry and later execute Anne. After his divorce from Catherine and the birth of his and Anne's first child, Elizabeth I, Parliament declared a 17-year-old Mary illegitimate with no claim to the throne, partially because it was seen as possible incestuous means, because Catherine, her mother, had previously been married to Henry's older brother Arthur. However, luckily enough, this would be reversed by the 1543 Right of Succession Act and by her loving father's will. Unluckily enough, Mary was denied access to her mother, who Henry had sent far away and never saw her again. Fortune smiled upon Mary after her brother Edward, son of Henry and Jane Seymour, his third wife, died of a terminal illness aged 15 after 8 years on the throne. Yes, he became king at 7. An agreement with Edward stated that Mary would be able to become queen if she renounced her Catholic roots. Mary did, but Mary was telling a fib. She was still a Catholic through and through. And so, with the blessing of her teenage brother and no male heirs, Mary became queen as the eldest daughter. She actually made history, the first regent queen of England. Edward had followed in his father's footsteps and was born a stoic Protestant, so she bided her time and waited cautiously. It took her a grand total of pretty much 0 days to begin completely reversing all of her father's and Edward's reforms, bringing England back to its glorious Catholic days. Mary, however, wasn't just Catholic. She was very Catholic. She revived old heresy laws that led to around 300 Protestants being burned at the stake. However, this isn't unusual behaviour for medieval monarchy. Henry himself had burned around 81 people for heresy, and her successor, Elizabeth I, would also execute scores of people based on their faith. The difference is, her successor, her sister Elizabeth, was a little bit more savvy in her practice. She instead would take these traitors into sheltered accommodation where they would pretty much just be hung, drawn and quartered under the public eye. It also happened that Protestant martyrs became powerful tools of folklore and legends. Their martyrdom would be seen as a suffering that needed to be done for the sake of the Protestant regime. When her half-sister Elizabeth I rose to power, she was a Protestant, much like her father and much like her younger half-brother. And as well as this, a lot of people at the time who had been suffering under the extreme Catholic rule of Mary would welcome this change. And so the legend did begin with Mary I, Bloody Mary. Mary, however, isn't the only person to be theorised to have inspired this game. Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess, and her history is a little bit more brutal, if you can believe it. She, however, was born into a Protestant nobility, and her family controlled Transylvania, and her uncle Stephen Bathory was King of Poland. Her childhood would have been extremely privileged, and she was an extremely smart lady. She was taught 4 separate languages: Hungarian, her native tongue, Latin, Greek, and German. It is said that her lesbian aunt was into sadomasochistic practices, and her uncle taught her in the arts of Satanism. In 1574, at the age of 14, Mary became pregnant by a peasant boy. This caused a little bit of a problem because at birth, Mary had been promised to a prince. Hang on a minute. Ferenc Nadasdy? I think. Ferenc. It's a cognate of Frank, so we'll call him Frank. Or Francois. No, we'll call him Frank. This meant that Elizabeth had to hide her pregnancy and give the baby girl away when it was born. That's pretty sad, actually. But she was in fact later married to Frank. Not too long after, actually. She was 15 years old. On the bright side, she did in fact become the Countess of Hungary and gain control of 10 castles. So that's pretty nice. Unfortunately, Frank was mostly away doing battle with the Turks. Fortunately, she was given as a wedding gift his favourite castle. Okay, so you're 15, you've just got married, you've had to give away your firstborn child, but you're now a countess with 10 castles, and your husband as a wedding gift gave you his favourite castle. For a girl in the 1500s, that's a pretty solid deal. But even nobles had to work. During the Long War of 1593 to 1606, Elizabeth was charged with the responsibility of taking care of her husband's estates. This meant that she was in charge of her husband's estates and their security. She had to make sure that the estates and all of the property were completely secure. There were actually several instances in which Elizabeth intervened on behalf of the poor. For example, hearing a case in which a woman's husband had been killed by an Ottoman soldier, and as well as this, another case where a woman's daughter had been violated and impregnated. During her marriage to Frank, she would give birth to 4 children. In English, their names are Paul, Anna, Ursula, and Catherine. While in public, Elizabeth appeared to be a responsible countess who was taking care of her husband's estates, security, and the poor, there was a much darker side to Elizabeth Bathory. As early as 1604, rumours of Elizabeth's cruel behaviour towards her female handmaidens and servants had already begun to spread. Lutheran minister Istvan Magyari had made complaints to her both privately and publicly within the court of Vienna. It took a long time for the Hungarian authorities to respond to Magyari's complaints, but eventually King Matthias II assigned Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, to investigate. Between 1610 and 1611, he put 2 notorities in charge of compiling witness testimonies, which numbered to over 300. According to witness testimonials, the victims of Elizabeth Bathory were peasant girls between the ages of 10 to 14, at least initially. They had been lured to the castle by a promise of well-paid work, which was heaven sent for the peasants at the time. Later, Elizabeth moved on to killing lesser noblewomen who had been sent to the castle to learn courtly etiquette by their parents. Witness testimonials revealed the things in which Elizabeth would do to her victims. These include burning with hot tongues and then being exposed to freezing water, burning off flesh, beating, mutilation, biting off flesh, freezing, starving, cannibalism, use of needles, covering the young girls in honey and then exposing them to live ants. There was also a report or 2 of a girl being doused in water and then sent out into the freezing winter. Others say that she would send dogs after the girls and watch them as they ran into the forest trying to evade the dogs. There are rumours in which Elizabeth Bathory would bathe in virgin's blood because she believed that it had rejuvenating properties. However, this is largely disputed because the amount of blood it would take to fill up a bath on a regular basis would have been a lot, and whether or not the bloodletting methods at the time would have been efficient enough for that is debatable. The sad thing about this case was if Elizabeth had stuck to the peasant women, she would have never been apprehended. It wasn't until 1609, when she began killing the lesser noblewomen, did she become noticed. The total body count of Elizabeth Bathory is unknown to this day. It's possible she may have killed up to or even over 600 girls and women. Her brutal nature and the rumours surrounding bloodletting and cannibalism was an attribute to the creation of Dracula. It's no surprise that Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Hungary, the Bloody Vampiress, the Bloody Countess, the Vampiress of Hungary, one who goes by many names, can be linked to the game Bloody Mary. So who is Bloody Mary? Well, these are just two of the likely suspects. Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, who murdered up to 300 Protestants, or Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Hungary, who killed up to 600 servant girls, but not before torturing them. I suppose it depends on who you asked. In England, if you said Bloody Mary, we would think of the monarchy. Perhaps if you went over to Hungary, they'd think of their countess. There are thousands of Marys in history, and a good chunk of them will have probably done some brutal things. And is her name even Mary? Scientists have tried to explain the Bloody Mary phenomenon by saying the reflection in the mirror and the dim lighting kind of confuses our stimuli and makes us see and hear things that might not be there. It's called the Troxler effect. When you focus on a singular stimuli for a long enough amount of time, your brain becomes used to the unchanging stimuli. Because of this, your neurons will cancel out the information in front of them and the image will become blurry or distorted, or may show things that aren't necessarily there. However, I will say as a psych grad and somebody who does acknowledge biological, psychological and neurological phenomena, I also do believe in some of the paranormal. And this is something I won't be inviting into my home.